Welcome to the Ideas 42 Academy Seminar Series. My name is Mitra Salosel, and I'm the Director of Communications at Ideas 42. And on behalf of all of us on the team, thank you for tuning in to learn more about applying behavioral science to tough social problems. Today, we're joined by two members of our own governance team to share a look at some of our work across multiple countries in our governance portfolio, focusing on improving officials' responsiveness to constituents' requests. Two members of our team, Laura and Katie, will share findings regarding behavioral barriers, the designs currently being implemented, and other takeaways from our work to improve responsiveness to constituents' requests. Before I hand it off to Laura, a small logistical matter. For those of you who may not have joined us for previous seminar series installments, we'll be taking questions through the Zoom Q&A box at the end of the presentation. We've built in about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the hour to have a robust discussion and answer all of your questions. But as the questions come to you throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box and we'll answer them live all at once. You can find that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any other questions logistically or anything, feel free to, or comments, drop them into the chat box. All right, I think that's everything. That people have stopped trickling in, so we've got our full attendee list. So without further ado, Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mitra. Thank you for the introductions. I am Laura Cojocaru, and with me here is also my colleague, Katie Silva. Both of us work for the governance focus area at Ideas 42. And as Mitra has said earlier, we are going to talk about a specific portfolio of projects that we have been working on, which is on improving officials' responsiveness to constituents' requests. Before I start, I want to also show you the other members of our beautiful team, including a former but very important and dear to us colleague, Josh Martin, who has since moved on from Ideas 42. So we are going to talk about behavioral science as responsiveness, as you have gathered from what Mitra and I were saying earlier, but you might be wondering, what has behavioral science have to do with fixing potholes? So to answer that question, I'm going to take a few steps back and show you this and ask you if you have ever heard, or if perhaps you yourself have any perceptions that about public servants that are somehow similar to what you're seeing here. Have you ever heard anecdotes, or have you maybe thought yourself that public officials are maybe not the hardest working people in the world? Or perhaps you have seen all these almost comic depictions of public servants as being not particularly competent, or in the more extreme cases, maybe even being corrupt or perhaps Machiavellian a little bit. Well, I think most of us have heard something along these lines. And as a matter of fact, perhaps these are not completely unfounded perceptions. There are quite a few studies beyond these anecdotes and perceptions that are indeed showing that perhaps public servants, or the ones that aspire to become public servants, maybe they don't have the best behavior all the time. So for example, in one study, it was shown that those who were more likely to cheat in a dice game were also more likely to have a preference to actually get a public sector job when they graduated. So these are students. But what's even more worrisome is that cheating in a dice game was also predictive of actual fraudulent behavior, which in that case of the study was absenteeism by real life nurses. Another study was showing that those people that were aspiring to become bureaucrats in the future were also more corrupt than those who were aspiring to just get a normal job in a private sector. So in this second study, in a lab experiment, people who wanted to get jobs as bureaucrats were actually over-reporting how much they needed to pay to some hypothetical workers that they were employing in this game, and they are also more likely to underpay those same hypothetical workers. So perhaps there is a little bit of a grain of truth to these perceptions. But as a matter of fact, what we have found through searches in the literature and through our own fieldwork is that many public servants, as a matter of fact, are highly motivated individuals. And along the same lines as the studies that I was showing earlier, if you don't believe our own anecdotes, then perhaps you would believe these studies that show that public sector workers are actually more intrinsically motivated than private sector workers. And there are also studies that show that if your recruitment for the job is done appropriately, you can actually attract candidates with higher pro-social motivation. So for example, if a job opening announcement focuses on the social importance of that job, as opposed to talking about career advancement opportunities or earning opportunities, it can actually attract higher quality candidates in terms of their pro-social motivation without actually harming their qualities from other points of view. So what's happening then? There are these two apparently contradicting views. There are these people who see and believe that maybe people are not behaving the best, public servants are not the best employees out there. But then there is also this view that, as a matter of fact, they are motivated, they want to do a good job. So what's happening? Well, in one of our previous white paper studies at Ideas 42, we thought a little bit about what might be these factors that are driving poor performance. So we found that in many contexts, public sector workers of all types are facing constant change. There is nothing constant in their jobs. Everything changes at all times, which perhaps you might argue that is also the case in other jobs, but it is particularly difficult for these public servants. They are also very often chronically understaffed. There are many studies that show that, particularly in developing countries, there is chronic understaffing. One person has to take care of many, many more requests or many, many more tasks than a person could normally do with any quality of work. And oftentimes they also have to deal with different types of systems. So there is the more official formal type of system that they are dealing with, but then there is this informal one that actually gets things done in some cases. And as I mentioned, this is particularly pronounced in developing countries. As a result, bureaucrats are often scarce in time, in resources, and overall mental bandwidth. And most of you are very familiar with the fact that scarcity has very important consequences for the way we make decisions and for the way we act. I don't think that comes as any surprise to anyone who has anything to do with behavioral science. I think most of you who have been at Ideas 42 webinars or are part of Ideas 42 have seen a version of this slide before. What this slide is showing is differently here is the fact that we are focusing on bureaucrats. It's not that just people are complicated. It's also the fact that bureaucrats, they are people. So as a result, they are complicated like all of us. However, they are so in systematic, predictable ways. Also, for them, as well as for other humans, contextual or design factors, regardless of how small they might seem to be, can have large impact on their actions and on their decisions. But as a result, we also have learned that low cost or perhaps even no cost behavioral interventions have a very good potential to actually improve outcomes and make the most of limited resources, which are particularly important in resource constrained environments, like governments, for example. So now let me take a bit of a step forward and move on from what governance has to do with behavioral science to responsiveness itself, because that is the topic of our presentation. I believe most of you have seen at least some times in your life images like this, things like this happening in your own cities. But have you ever wondered what actually happens? You see a problem like this, and in most cases, in a day or two, or maybe even sooner than that, the problem gets resolved. How does it get resolved? What is the process involved in going from this huge pothole or a leaking hydrant or pipe or overgrown bushes or a tree in the street? How do we get from there to normal life? A very simple, perhaps too simple answer would be that oftentimes a constituent, a person like you and I, actually flags this problem to the government, to their local government. So they make a request. I would like this tree to be removed from my street. And then lots of things happen in the local government. They receive this request, they make some sort of decisions, they kind of make plans, and eventually, hopefully sooner than later, they send people in to fix that problem. And that's how you see that, you can now drive again on your street, and there are no trees and so on. So how does this happen really? These are the main steps, but the very first step to this, as you saw, is that someone actually has to flag that problem. Someone has to say, there is a problem here, there is a tree in the street, the local government may not be aware of that. One of the most important recent innovations in this area were the civic monitoring platforms and civic-tech. So civic-tech was a huge improvement in the sense that it allowed citizens to more easily and seamlessly alert the municipality that there is a problem, but more than that, it made it easier for the citizens, for the constituents to actually hold the governments accountable to actually resolving those issues. That was a great improvement in this area. But it's not enough. As you saw, that is not the last step. It's only the beginning. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Again, going back to studies, they do show that oftentimes, even though constituents' engagement has improved with the advent of these ICT-enabled platforms, the civic technology platforms, that does not necessarily result in improved government responsiveness to these requests. Well, why might that be? In a previous project that Ideas 42 has conducted, we tried to map what happens within the government once a request is received. What we learned is that there are many steps and many actors that have to actively take decisions and actions in this space. So for example, once the request is received, someone who could be either a technician that looks at the request received through a platform, or perhaps a person that stays in a call center and actually talks to the citizen, they have to verify that that information is complete and it's accurate. Then that request has to make it to the right person that is responsible for its execution. That person will have to make decisions because they will have lots and lots of requests that they have to attend to. They have to prioritize them. Eventually, that person or perhaps another team will execute the actions required. And throughout this entire process, ideally, the government would communicate with the citizens. They would tell them what is happening to their request. Has it been received? Has it been approved? Will it be taken care of? On what timeline, and so on. And finally, once the request is acted upon, it has to be marked as resolved within that system, and the citizen has to be notified. So as you can see, this is just a simplified version, a very simplified version of what's actually happening. But as you can imagine, there are many, many more behaviors than these steps that are actually involved. Well, as you also probably can imagine, when there are so many actors and so many behaviors, there are also many opportunities for failure. There are many opportunities for someone not to make the right decision or not act in the right way, which is where behavioral science kind of steps in. In a previous paper that Ideas 42 has worked on, we try to think about the various types of governance-related areas where behavioral science may or may not be suited for to provide solutions. there are some criteria that we came up with that kind of try to identify which types of actions might be more prone to actually react or to actually have the best outcomes from a behavioral intervention. Among those factors are the frequency with which a behavior is happening, the number of people who are actually performing that behavior, but also the fact that those actors, people who are performing those behaviors, they need to want to act in the right way. There needs to be, in other words, there needs to be an intention-action gap. So let's think about responsiveness to requests. Indeed, these behaviors that someone would have to perform on the government side, they tend to be quite frequent. They also tend to be systematic. One person may not work on only one type of request. They might work on different types of requests. However, that number of requests is limited. There are only so many behaviors that one has to do. And while they may not do them day in and day out, they actually repeat with a certain frequency. Usually there is a team of people who are performing those same behaviors, not just one person. And finally, from our qualitative work in the field, and also from reading different papers that have been put out in this area, we learned that most government officials really do want to perform their jobs well. They want to serve the citizens. They want to actually resolve these problems. They are often are residents of the same city in which they work. So they do have the motivation, the right motivation to act. In conclusion, we came up with the idea that, you know what, responsiveness is a great area. There is a lot of opportunity that behavioral science might play a positive role. We might maybe make a difference here. So without further introduction, now I would like to actually talk about what we are doing currently in applying behavioral science to improve responsiveness. So we are going to briefly do a bit of a case study and walk you through some of the work that we have been doing for the past year and a half in this area. Where do we work? Well, after an initial phase in which we are trying to scope what would be some good partners and where we could work and what would be the main countries where we would have good opportunities to work in this area, we settled on several projects, one in South Africa with the city of Cape Town, another one in India with a civic-tech platform called EGAV, who is a partner of many municipalities in the state of PRADESH, then in Brazil with the city of Sao Paulo directly, but also separately with another civic-tech provider called OLAB, who is partnered with many other smaller Brazilian municipalities. So we are currently running about 5 different projects in this area, because in Brazil, we are actually doing 2 different types of projects with OLAB that are not showing up here separately. I've been talking about improving responsiveness, but what does that really mean? Improving what? How do we want to improve responsiveness, and what are these dimensions of responsiveness that matter? Based on our previous work, we came up with 4 separate dimensions, one of them being timeliness. What does it mean? Well, if a request is resolved, it does matter if it gets resolved immediately or if it takes a really, really long time. You can imagine the consequences of a leaking pipe in the middle of the city not being resolved for 1 month, for example. Then accuracy. Sure, you can say that something has been resolved, but has it been resolved appropriately? Has the problem really disappeared? Is it what the citizen was actually talking about? Equity. You can also imagine various scenarios in which different citizens, different constituents, or different neighborhoods from a municipality, from a city, are not treated equally. So perhaps if the request comes from the more affluent part of the city, is being taken very seriously, it is prioritized, and it is resolved very, very well. And perhaps if it comes from a not so rich part of the town, perhaps it kind of plays a second role. Maybe it will be done eventually and maybe with less care. And finally, satisfaction. Even though the request gets resolved eventually, how happy, how satisfied is the citizen with this entire process? That could include the quality of the resolution itself, but it could also include the quality of the experience they had, the experience they had interacting with the municipality, with the platform, how they were being communicated with, and so on. So here are the problems that we actually settled on. I'm going to show them on this diagram of the steps that are involved in request resolution, and I'm going to show you where they happen to be. In the city of Cape Town, we learned that the most pressing problem that the city was facing was the fact, or one of the most pressing problems, I should say, in terms of request resolution, was the fact that intake staff, which are actually people working in a call center capturing requests from the citizens, they do not capture complete or correct geolocation. Where is the request located? Where is the problem located? And its category. This may not seem like a big thing. However, the consequence is that if a request is not properly geolocated or categorized, it might end up being rejected after a while, or it might just waste resources in trying to geolocate it properly over time. In India, with the government of Andhra Pradesh, but also in with OLAB, which, as I said, is working with several municipalities in Brazil, we found that the timeliness of request resolution was an issue. It was happening at slightly different steps in the process. In India, for example, people working on request resolution were not doing certain things as fast as they could, whereas in OLAB, the problem was much more localized. It was about forwarding a request to someone else when you realize that it does not belong to you. And we found that the civic servants were not doing that quickly enough, even though all it took was one click or almost one click. You just had to imagine forward an email. That was pretty much all they had to do. They were sometimes taking a really, really long time. And during that time, the request was not being addressed by anyone. And finally, in Sao Paulo and with another single municipality in Brazil, we decided to work on communications. So with the city of Sao Paulo, request resolution, the execution actually means offering citizens proper information. So they call the call center and they ask for information about certain services or certain actions that they need to perform. And those call center operators, they are supposed to give them clear, complete, and correct information about next steps and what they are supposed to do. We learned that they are not doing that properly, whereas with the other municipality in Brazil, we learned that the problem was not so much about this. The requests were more in the usual sense that people would call about, I don't know, say a pothole in the street, but they were not receiving any type of communication throughout the process. So they would not know if the request is now being addressed or not. Maybe it was rejected, when will it be done, and so on. So what I want to actually emphasize here is not so much what the problems were, but the fact that without this being our intention, we found that these problems were spanning pretty much all the steps from the request being received to the request being resolved. So they just happen, they can happen at any stage of the request resolution process. As we moved on into understanding why these problems were happening, we have learned that there are a multitude of psychologies and psychological and behavioral barriers that were leading to these issues. So these are just a few of them. But what we have also learned was that despite the diversity of behaviors that we are working on, despite the different types of people that we are working on, And despite the very different contexts, there were some categories that were coming up in nearly all of these projects that we are working on. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Katie, who is actually going to walk you through some of the barriers that we found. And I want to stress out that these are just the ones that were the most prevalent ones, and we think that they might have relevance for other contexts as well. Katie?
Thanks, Laura. So just to reiterate what Laura was saying about what makes these findings so exciting for us is that, like she said, despite the fact that these are really different contexts, the fact that there were so many overlaps in the projects, both in terms of the specific aspects of the context that the lower level officials were working in, and as a result, the barriers, that was a really interesting takeaway from the work that we've been doing. And in particular, it reinforces some of the hypotheses we had in our most recent white paper about how how behavioral science can be applicable in the government context. And so the first one that I want to talk about is hassles. So one aspect that was very similar across the context that we've been working in is that officials encounter a lot of hassles in their work. And this can come in many different shapes and forms, like things have to be done manually, or they involve a lot of steps. Things aren't always designed in ways that are very intuitive or easy to use. And so I'm just going to show you a few examples of what this looks like in the platforms. Next slide, Lona. So on the left here, you see the platform that a call operator in São Paulo would look at. And essentially what you're looking at is that while they're on the call with the citizen or constituent, they actually have to navigate a number of different pages in order to get to the information page that will tell them what information to tell the citizen. So there's a lot of steps in that navigation process. On the top right is a screenshot. I don't know if it's really small for you, but what I want you to notice is that this is one step in the process of submitting a request in this particular platform. And it's the step that involves including the address that the request is being submitted about. And as you can see, there's like 8 to 10 different fields that the official has to fill out in order to just submit one piece of information, the address about the request. And then lastly, on the bottom right, you can see, so as Laura was describing before, one of the problems we were working on was in re-forwarding requests. And so this is a screenshot of the list of people that you would get when you're trying to re-forward the request to someone. So as you can see, it's a very long list, and it's not necessarily organized in any particular way. And so that can make it really challenging to actually find the person who you want to forward that request to. Next slide. Yeah. So the second aspect about these contexts that seemed very prevalent was that government officials very commonly experience scarcity. So they juggle many different responsibilities, and in a lot of the interviews we did, they often describe not having enough time each day to complete everything that they have to do. They have small teams, few resources that they have to work with. And so next slide. How that manifested in the Andhra Pradesh context is that, again, they described having a lot of different responsibilities that they were handling, including smaller administrative tasks all the way to more complex things like preparing for elections. And they had to split that time with spending the day in the field, actually doing the execution work to resolve requests. And so that left very little time for them to be able to focus on other equally important tasks, such as responding to the requests, which some of them ended up falling through the cracks. And then similarly, in the context of Cape Town, we actually found that there was almost a perception of scarcity that was being reinforced by the feedback mechanisms and were available to the call operators. So they were receiving a lot of feedback about how long they were spending on calls, and then they were also penalized if they spent too long on calls. That would start to eat up the break time that they had to use the bathroom, drink water, and whatnot. And so what ended up happening is they would really try to finish calls as quickly as they could, and that left them more prone to making mistakes in the process of registering information. The next theme that was very common that we saw was that despite our limited ability to take in a lot of information at once, government officials are actually often expected to juggle a lot of different tasks. And as I mentioned in the scarcity example, but also a lot of pieces of information all at the same time. And the platforms and tools that they use to help them do their job aren't always designed in the way that draws their attention to the information that they need at the right time. And so in the Sao Paulo context, what that looked like was that call operators, for example, have to reference a lot of different resources while they're on the call with the constituent. So for example, they have their call script open, they have the platform where they're lodging the request into, a platform that shows them the information about the call, like how long they've been on the call, among other things, are all open on their computer screen while they're attending to this constituent on the phone. And on top of that, they're also handling many different types of requests throughout the day. So they're constantly having to switch between, okay, now I'm doing a tree request, now I'm doing a pothole request, while all of these materials are open on their page. And so that can make it more challenging for them to listen to the citizen while they're on the call and then register the correct information. Similarly, on CoLab's platform, we found that the requests that should be prioritized are not always easy for the officials to find. So for example, the request list that they have access to is ordered by default by creation date. So whenever the citizen or constituent logs that request, that becomes the creation date. And so I might receive a request today that somebody sent, one of my colleagues sent to me today, and the creation date might have been a month ago. And what ends up happening is that that request will end up at the bottom of my list, as opposed to other requests that came in today from the constituent. When really I should be focusing on that older request that has been in progress for a longer period of time. I end up focusing on those requests that are coming in immediately. And so we see this mismatch in the prioritization. Lastly, another thing that cropped up in most of the contexts that we've been working in is faulty mental models. And usually this was about the responsibilities that they felt that they should be prioritizing. And some of these are unconscious, so they're not even aware that they might be deprioritizing some tasks that the leadership expects them to prioritize. And then other aspects of the environment, like diffusion of responsibility or feedback that emphasizes one aspect of the job over another, can often reinforce some of these mental models without intending to. So in Cape Town, the main way this came up was that the focus in terms of feedback, quality assurance, and all that seemed to focus mostly on customer centricity. And so what ended up happening is that operators would focus a lot more on being polite and kind to the constituents, which is very important, but then that would cause them to, that would be detrimental to them actually capturing and registering information in the right amount of detail into the system, which is also equally as important for request resolution. And then lastly, we noted possible mental models associated with prioritization of requests that officials receive in the CoLab platform as well during our review of the platform. And so as we've been talking about, one of the simplest ways to decrease the amount of time that it takes to resolve a request overall is to pass along the requests that aren't your responsibility. So if I'm getting 5 different requests and some of them are my responsibility and some aren't, I should be accepting those that are mine and forwarding those that are not mine quickly. And we found that that wasn't the case. And so there were features of this environment that allowed the officials to kind of deprioritize this particular behavior and postpone it to later. For example, they didn't receive feedback about how long they were taking to do this behavior, and they often weren't, there were often no consequences associated with not handling these requests quickly. So that made it more likely for them to postpone. So now what? We've shared some of the common themes that we've observed across all the countries. And now what we're doing is developing and implementing interventions to both address these barriers that we talked about, and then also the other barriers that we haven't mentioned, which are specific to each of the contexts that we've been working with. And we won't have time to go through all of the different designs. And so, and some of them are still in development. So I'm just going to dive deep into one of the contexts and so show you the designs that we implemented on the COLAB platform in 3 different Brazilian municipalities. And I just want to note that this example focuses only on platform tweaks, but there are actually many places in each of the different contexts we've been working with. There are actually many places that are ripe for behavioral science intervention. So in some other projects and countries, we're using either a combination of tweaks on the platform or just focusing on other channels that are prevalent in those contexts, such as the call operator scripts, other types of communication channels that they use, such as WhatsApp or trainings, etc. So let me just, can you go back to the previous slide, Lana? So this is just a recap of the barriers that these particular designs that I'm going to share are actually addressing. So first is that they're not actually able to find the requests easily that they should be prioritizing. There's not a real sense of urgency to address these types of requests quickly. And then there's actually some hassles in the process of forwarding that make it a little bit difficult for them to do that quickly. Thank you. So the first thing that we wanted to do is to increase the salience of these requests. So we added a column that had included an attribution date, so the date that it was forwarded to you, and then made the requests ordered by that date rather than the creation date. However, we still gave them the ability to modify the order by different criteria if they felt that they preferred that. But it was a way to make sure that they had on top of their inbox the requests that are coming into them immediately, rather than those that were created immediately. The other thing was to try to increase the salience of the older than others. And so we made the requests red that were above the deadline, re-forwarding the request. The second thing that we wanted to do was make it a little bit easier for them to forward requests. So a couple of ways we did that was, if you remember that screenshot I showed to you about that giant list with all of the potential people that they could forward that request to, one thing we incorporated was a most frequently used list of 3 names that they could choose from that would make it a bit easier for them to just select and move forward. And then the other thing that they were asked to do, that they were prompted to do by the platform, is send a message. Every time they forward a request, they have to send a message. And it's blank, and they usually don't get any guidance about what to write. And so we included some predetermined reasons that they could select from when they're forwarding, and then that would pre-populate a text that they can then edit and send immediately. We also included some individualized feedback about how they were doing in terms of how quickly they were able to be re-forwarding requests. And we included some norms about what it meant to be doing well. So the deadline is 1 day for them to be able to assess whether a request is their responsibility or not, and then accept or forward to someone else. And so when those bars get below 1 day, they become green. To kind of emphasize that behavior. And then the other thing we wanted to do is reward them if they are doing that within the deadline. And so they get a streak, gamification in this design, in that they get a streak whenever they're able to do that with a deadline for multiple consecutive days.
Katie? I think maybe Katie's internet is failing her, but it's lucky because this is happening just about when she was done presenting the slides. I think the only thing that we wanted to tell you about this case study or these case studies is that all of these projects are currently in slightly different stages, but most of them have already designs that have been done. Some of them are already being implemented and they are in the middle of testing. Whereas for others, we are still trying to figure out the next steps about implementation and development of the designs that we have put together. But really what we want to learn eventually is what is the effect of these behavioral interventions? Do they really have an impact on those measures that I was talking about earlier that define good responsiveness to citizens' requests? So just to summarize what we have been talking about, we have learned that generally, when we look at all these projects and all of these people across the board, we see that they are all in a nearly constant state of cognitive scarcity. This is driven by different reasons in different contexts, but usually they are understaffed, they have to deal with multiple tasks and responsibilities, and often there is time pressure to deal with certain jobs. Now, some of these are justified, and there is not so much you can do about it. The fact that they don't have enough people, for example, to deal with requests may not be something that is behavioral, but then there are others that are absolutely unnecessary. And once you recognize the amount of cognitive scarcity that people are faced with, you can actually solve those issues. Furthermore, there are hassles. There are hassles like the one that Katie was talking about that have to do with the platforms and the software that they have to use in their daily jobs, but then there are other hassles in their environment. These platform designs, which, as I mentioned, are innovative and extremely helpful, they often do not address, and in some cases, as we have seen, they can even make worse cognitive biases and limitations. But beyond issues that have to do with platforms, there are a lot of other internal processes, internal dealings and organizational issues that are either creating faulty mental models or fail to correct the ones that people may have created already. So these have to do with very different steps that have to do with responsiveness. So we also learned that despite these issues, behavioral science could do quite a bit to fix these issues. Perhaps the lower hanging fruit is to work with government and civic tech platforms to remove hassles, to address certain cognitive limitations, to remove certain processes and decision making where possible, and perhaps even though that may not be the main issue, increase officials' motivation to excel, particularly in the tasks in which they tend to perform less well. But beyond working on the platforms, changing the designs of these platforms and doing small tweaks to the way they work, there are other things that could be done with relative ease. Some of the knowledge materials that are being used, the training, the feedback, the quality assurance, some of the ways the processes are being organized internally could also be improved in ways that lead to more positive outcomes and address some of the behavioral barriers that we have noticed throughout this project. The responsiveness work is only part of what we do in our governance practice area. And even with this, we are just beginning to scratch the surface. We are at the stage at which this work is still innovative, is not being done on any large scale, if at all, throughout the world. So we are just trying to create more evidence. We are trying to build up an evidence base of what works and actually prove that behavioral science has something to say about this topic and it can create positive outcomes. But we hope that once this initial work is done, there will be more replication work of successful interventions. And eventually our bolder vision for the future is that behavioral science will not just be this interesting thing, this research project that is being done here and there by outsiders like ourselves, but it rather becomes a very common feature. So whenever someone thinks about public sector reform, they immediately think about behavioral science as one of the most useful tools, or one of the tools that they have at their disposal. So that concludes all we had to show you today, but we are very happy to answer any questions and to receive your feedback either now or by email after this presentation. All of this work is still in progress. We are not at the end by any means, so we are very happy to continue this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Laura and Katie, for that presentation. We do have 11 minutes left to take questions. So if anyone's been kind of thinking about something, not sure they wanted to share it yet, go ahead and drop it into the Q&A box. And while we are waiting, I can go ahead and plug our next crash course in behavioral science that Ideas 42 Academy is putting on. If you were intrigued by some of the concepts that Laura and Katie provided a very brief overview on and want to learn more about this, we do offer a remote crash course in behavioral science at the 101 level. And our next installment is coming up June 14th through 17th. Which is coming up quickly, but we do have a few spots available for anyone that's interested in learning more. Give it a couple more minutes. If anyone has any questions whatsoever, please go ahead and drop them into the chat box. I have a question as well. Katie, apologies if you had gone into this on the slide, but in the section where you were talking about the designs, I was curious where you were building in the new kind of like feedback dashboard for public officials and like where that was going to fit into their workflow.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I apologize that I fell out, my internet bugged for a second.
No worries, that's Zoom life for you.
Yes, unfortunately. But yeah, so where did we plug it in? Essentially, there's several different tabs in the platform that officials use when they're accessing their account. And the first tab that they use is the home. The tab that has all of their requests is the monitor. And so whenever they first log into their platform, they get taken to the home page as a default. And at the outset, the homepage was a fairly outdated area where they kind of had like very generic statistics about these are how many users are using CoLab platform. These are how many people have likes on the platform. And so that's where the new designs live to give them feedback. So whenever they're logging into their platform, they can have a chance to see how they're doing, both in terms of their speed for re-forwarding requests, but also there's a couple more designs that we didn't show that show more broadly like how they're doing in terms of the resolution process.
Great, thank you. Do you have a sense of what your timeline is for rolling out implementation and gathering data on all of these designs?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to the particular CoLab platform timeline. So the designs are in process of evaluation. So they were implemented in February and we'll be collecting data until the end of August because each of the designs were kind of implemented at slightly different timings. And so we'll be collecting data until the end of August and we'll hopefully have some findings to share maybe September. So stay tuned for those findings. And then we also have, for the São Paulo project, we're in the process of developing the designs at the moment, and those are likely to be later this summer. And yeah, ideally we'll do a test for that as well, and we'll have some findings for that.
What I want to add about these timelines is that while initially there was a lot of work done on selecting the best partners and the best countries to work in for various criteria, then a lot of uncertainty hit us, and somehow our amazing partners happened to be among the hardest hit countries in terms of COVID, and a lot of the work was very difficult to execute and implement on time. But we are hopeful that things are looking up for all of these countries in the near future. But as you know, even currently, some of these countries are still facing a not so great situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an excellent point, Laura. Okay, we have a couple of questions in now. So the first one is from Brett B. Can you talk more about the process methods? It seems like you did a lot of interviews and observations, but they don't want to assume. Can you talk about also the stakeholders and the projects who were involved in the process of getting the project started?
Yes, so I can talk about the process a little bit, and it is, if you're familiar with the Ideas 42 methodology, if you're not, if you are familiar, apologies, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But we essentially go through several stages to determine what the behavioral problem is and then what the barriers are. And so in the process of determining the behavioral problem, we did a lot of interviews with the stakeholders, a few interviews with the actual government officials whose behaviors we were trying to look at. And it's really in the diagnosis process. So once we've what behavioral problem we want to focus on based on a number of different criteria, including impact, how applicable behaviors are, and whatnot. We then go through a very rigorous process of doing a lot of interviews. And one challenge that we had because of COVID was that we couldn't be in the context. So I was actually living in Brazil, and was in South Africa and India, who were going to be doing this process in country. But because of COVID, some of us had to come back to the US. And so we weren't able to do the observations and interviews as we normally have. But what we ended up doing was several reviews of the platforms in that a lot of our team members and members of the partner teams as well, we did reviews of the platform where we would go through and kind of do a try to investigate which areas there might be barriers that government officials are facing. And then we did most of our interviews remotely. And so you're not assuming wrong. And then I forget the second half of the is there a way for me to look at the question?
Absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about the stakeholders in the projects who were involved in the process of getting the project started?
So Laura mentioned in the beginning that we had a previous project that we were working on initially to get a better understanding of how behavioral science can actually have an impact in the responsiveness area. And so in the process of doing that, we had a lot of interviews with different civic-tech platforms and different governments to try to scope out potential partners. And the people that we were talking to, essentially folks within the civic-tech platform, so people that are actually running those platforms. We were talking to governments who either contract those tech platforms or governments that actually implement their own tech platforms. And it really depends in terms of what government you're working with, but in a lot of the contexts we were working with, it was usually the innovation department that we were talking to in each of the governments. So hopefully that answers your question, but that's kind of where we started this process.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katie. So we have time for one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. This is from Flora. Based on your experience working on multiple locations, do you think it is likely that the interventions designed could be scaled to other contexts directly, or are they context specific and too particular to each city's process?
That's a great question, Flora, and I must flag that Flora is actually one of the people that are or has been working with us on one of the projects in Brazil. And she knows a lot about the context in Sao Paulo, but also she knows a lot about behavior science. So that's a doubly appreciated question, Flora. I think it's a bit early to say that any of these will actually work in other contexts, since we are still in the process of testing how well and if they work even in the context for which they were designed. Of course, we are very hopeful that they will help, but generally I would not advise anyone to take the exact same design and transfer it, at least not at this point, to a completely different design, to a completely different location without further testing. There is a caveat to that, that some of these designs are relatively low cost, and it's very unlikely that they will have any negative consequences. For example, removing hassles from the process of, I don't know, answering an email or something like that. It's very likely to help. It's not particularly likely to harm, and it's relatively cheap and easy to implement. So there are cases in which maybe the cost of testing something is not justified, but it's also too early to say that definitely this is what will make a huge improvement in the responsiveness time, let's say. So I know that that is not a very straightforward yes/no answer, but I suppose it's a depends answer.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that too, I think what makes this work that we're doing, I think, so promising, and the fact we're able to see so many overlaps, is that maybe there is a chance that these might be, some of the aspects of the designs that we're developing might be applicable, but again, with all the caveats that Laura mentioned.
Great, thank you both so much. We're right at the hour, so I think we can go ahead and end it there. Thank you again, Laura and Katie, for sharing insights from this portfolio of projects. And thanks to all of you for spending an hour with us and for your questions. We'll be sending a recording of this session to each of you in the coming days. If you have any lingering questions for either Katie or Laura, you can feel free to reach out to them. Laura, if you want to put your email addresses back up on the screen. Otherwise, you can reach out to us at any time at academy@ideas42.org. And if excuse me, as ever, you can find out more information about all of our work in the Academy, upcoming seminar series, or the crash course I mentioned earlier at ideas42.org/academy. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time in the Ideas 42 Academy.